It starts with something so small, it barely makes a sound, a slap across a woman's face in a crowded courtroom. But what comes next will tear open the foundations of an entire city. When two arrogant cops strike a quiet black woman, they think they've crushed another voice into silence. What they don't know is she's no ordinary bystander, she's the judge. And in the next few minutes, their empire of corruption will begin to crumble. Stay with us, because the twist that follows will shake everything you think you know about power and justice. Charleston, South Carolina, had always worn two faces, one of charm, with its graceful streets and painted porches, and one of buried anger, lingering in the humid air. Judge Clara May knew both faces intimately. That morning, as she stepped into the courthouse, silver-streaked hair pinned neatly back, brown eyes sharp with experience, she sensed the city's tension thicker than usual. She didn't need her robe to command respect. 30 years had etched authority into her very presence. But the courthouse walls, old and indifferent, had seen too much injustice to tremble now. Clara carried herself like a quiet storm, unseen by those too arrogant to notice, unstoppable by those foolish enough to try. It was supposed to be a routine morning, a minor vandalism case, a teenage defendant, a bored public defender. Nothing worth remembering. But trouble was already waiting inside, in the form of Sergeant Travis Boone. Boone was everything Clara had spent her career outmaneuvering: entitlement wrapped in a badge, arrogance polished by generations of unchallenged authority. He stood at the prosecution table, arms crossed, face sour, radiating the kind of impatience that smelled of unchecked power. He didn't even glance her way when she entered, just barked orders at the clerk, acting like he owned the courtroom. Clara, not yet robed and still appearing to him as just another clerk or assistant, moved toward a side table to review the case file. She had only taken 2 steps when Boone, frustrated at what he saw as insubordination, stormed over. His voice cut across the murmuring room like a whip. "Hey! I'm talking to you!" Before she could turn, before a word could leave her mouth, his hand struck. The slap cracked the air. Sharp. Loud. Final. The courtroom froze in collective shock. Coffee cups halted midair. Pens stopped scribbling. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to flicker in stunned disbelief. Clara stood perfectly still, the sting on her cheek blooming like a silent flare. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her gaze on Boone. Their eyes locked. For a long moment, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. And Boone, puffed up with bravado, sneered down at her, muttering, "You people need to learn some respect." He still didn't know. He still thought he'd slapped a nobody. But the room knew. The few early arriving attorneys, the officers at the back wall, the court clerk who had gone pale, they knew exactly who she was. And they knew exactly what Boone had just done. Clara stepped forward, small but thunderous. No robe. No gavel. Just raw authority radiating from every fiber of her being. She asked in a voice so sharp it sliced through the stunned silence, "Is this how you treat officers of the court, Sergeant?" The blood drained from Boone's face, but it was already too late. Because the spark had been struck. And Charleston was about to burn. Boone blinked, his bravado slipping like a mask that no longer fit. For a man so used to controlling rooms with barked orders and flexed authority, it took him a moment too long to realize. He wasn't the one in charge anymore. Clara, moving with the slow inevitability of a rising tide, stepped up to the bench. She didn't need the robe to claim it. Her presence alone transformed the empty seat into a throne. She ascended the platform, turned, and faced the room, her courtroom. The shift was immediate and irreversible. Every pair of eyes shifted to her. Even the reporters, who had been half-dozing through morning arraignments, sat bolt upright, pens poised over notepads. "Sergeant Boone," she said, her voice cold steel wrapped in velvet, "did you just strike a sitting judge inside her own courtroom?" A bead of sweat slipped down Boone's temple. His mouth opened, then shut. His brain scrambled for an excuse, a lie, a lifeline. But there was no lifeline here. He stammered. "I didn't know who you were." Clara's face remained a mask of unflinching calm. "That," she said, "is not an answer." Around the room, attorneys began pulling out their phones under the table, quietly pressing record. "Yes or no, Sergeant?" she pressed, her voice tightening. "Did you put your hand on me?" The silence dragged until finally, broken and small, He muttered, "Yes." The words hit the air like a verdict. Clara nodded once, crisply. "Let the record reflect that the defendant has admitted to striking the presiding judge during a court session." She glanced at the court clerk, who was frantically typing but not fast enough to catch the gravity of the moment. Boone shifted his weight, clearly calculating how to claw his way out of the hole he'd dug. "You weren't in your robe," he barked suddenly, voice desperate. "How was I supposed to know?" Clara's gaze never wavered. "If I had been a white male judge, in jeans and a t-shirt, would you have laid a hand on me without a second thought?" Boone froze. The question was a trap, and he knew it. But there was no good answer now. "You assumed you could dismiss me," Clara said, voice rising just enough to cut across the room. "You assumed I had no authority, no power. And you acted on that assumption with violence." She turned to Officer Mills, the senior bailiff standing by the wall, rigid with contained rage. "Officer Mills, please detain Sergeant Boone for immediate internal investigation pending assault charges." Mills moved without hesitation. Boone stepped back, hands half raised in surrender, confusion and fear battling across his face. "You're overreacting," he spat. "This is ridiculous." Clara stood tall behind the bench, her voice dropping into a tone that made even the marble walls seem to lean closer. "Sergeant," she said softly, "this is not an overreaction. This is the collapse of an empire built on the assumption that people like me would stay silent." And as Mills approached with steady, deliberate steps, it finally sank in for Boone. The world he thought he ruled had just cracked under his feet. And the fall had only begun. The courtroom, once a place where whispered deals and silent injustices were routine, now pulsed with a different energy, one electric with reckoning. As Boone stood stunned, Officer Mills approached, his every movement measured and professional. He placed a firm but respectful hand on Boone's arm, not yet applying cuffs, but making it abundantly clear there would be no escape. "You can't do this," Boone hissed under his breath, glancing frantically toward the other officers at the back of the room, but they stared at their shoes, frozen, unwilling to tether themselves to a sinking ship. Clara remained standing, her hands lightly gripping the edge of the bench as if grounding herself, steady and unshakable. "Sergeant Boone, you are temporarily detained pending investigation into criminal assault on a judicial officer," she said, each word deliberate, resonating through the hushed room. The clerk, a young woman whose hands shook slightly over the keys, captured every syllable. In the gallery, cell phones remained steadily aimed forward, witnesses now, documentarians of a moment history would not easily forget. Boone struggled, still trying to find footing. "You're making a mistake," he said, louder now, voice rising in pitch and desperation. "You're blowing this out of proportion. I was doing my job." Clara slowly descended the bench, the click of her shoes on marble punctuating the gravity of the moment. She walked toward Boone, stopping a few feet in front of him. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, sharper, impossible to ignore. "Your job, Sergeant," she said, "is to uphold the law, not to believe yourself above it." The words cut through the room like a blade. "You assaulted an officer of the court, not because you were threatened, but because you were inconvenienced. You raised your hand not out of fear, but out of entitlement." Boone's jaw tightened, his fists clenching and unclenching as though he could will himself out of this nightmare. But it was too late. The world he thought would shield him had already started to turn against him. From the back of the room, the teenager he'd arrested, a slight kid in a wrinkled hoodie, watched with wide eyes. Clara caught the boy's gaze for a moment and offered the barest nod, a silent message, "You're not invisible. I see you." Turning back to the courtroom, Clara addressed the entire gallery now. "What happened today is not an isolated incident. It is the product of a culture that rewards power over principle, aggression over accountability." Reporters scribbled furiously. Attorneys exchanged glances. Some nodded subtly, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and awe. "And today," Clara continued, "we say enough." She stepped back toward the bench, but not to sit. She stood before it, facing the people, not towering above them. "In accordance with the authority vested in me by the state of South Carolina, I am initiating a formal review of Sergeant Boone's conduct and every case he has touched within the past decade. Effective immediately, all ongoing cases in which Sergeant Boone is a primary witness are hereby suspended pending review." Boone's face drained of color. His empire, years of intimidation, shortcuts, and silent complicity, had begun to collapse around him, and he could do nothing but stand and watch. Justice, long denied, was no longer whispering. It was roaring to life. As the weight of Clara's declaration settled over the room, an invisible line seemed to split the space. On one side stood those clinging desperately to a crumbling order. On the other, those who had waited their entire lives to see someone brave enough to dismantle it. Sergeant Boone, his swagger stripped away, tried one last feeble move. "You think this will change anything?" he spat toward Clara, his voice trembling with something between rage and fear. "You think you can tear down everything we built with a few words?" Clara took one slow step closer, her voice so calm it cut deeper than any shout. "I'm not tearing it down with words, Sergeant. I'm exposing it with truth. And the thing about truth is, once seen, it cannot be unseen." The courtroom doors opened then, and 2 internal affairs officers entered, their badges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Without ceremony, without fanfare, they moved toward Boone. He flinched, instinctively reaching for authority that no longer existed. "You are hereby placed under investigation pending criminal charges," one of the officers said, his voice flat but undeniable. "Please come with us." There were no handcuffs yet, not because Boone had earned respect, but because Clara had insisted that even those who fell should be treated with the dignity they had denied others. Boone hesitated, glancing one last time around the room for an ally, a savior, a lifeline. There was none. He followed the officers out, the heavy doors closing behind them with a thud that echoed like a verdict. Clara turned back to the gallery. Many of those watching seemed shell-shocked, unsure whether they had just witnessed the fall of a man or the beginning of something much larger. She spoke again, this time not just to the courtroom, but to every reporter, every citizen who would hear these words. "Today is not about one man's actions," she said, steady and clear. "It is about a system that allowed those actions to thrive. A system that rewarded brutality and silenced truth. A system that believed it was untouchable." She scanned the room, her eyes catching the faces of young law students, weary public defenders, veteran journalists. "You are the witnesses," she said. "You are the stewards of what comes next." One journalist, a young black woman sitting near the aisle, rose to her feet, then another, and another, until half the courtroom stood in silent acknowledgment. Clara's throat tightened, but she kept her voice firm. "We will rebuild," she promised. "Not on fear. Not on silence. But on justice." In the corner, Carter watched with pride radiating from him like heat. He had seen Clara battle courtroom politics, racial prejudice, and bureaucratic inertia for years. But never like this. Never with the full force of a woman who had stopped asking permission to change the world. As Clara gathered her notes, preparing to exit the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of herself in the polished wood of the bench, not the weary judge worn down by years of compromise, but the fighter she had always been. And though the empire of silence had begun to crumble, she knew the real fight was just beginning. Outside those walls, the city buzzed with rumors and fear. Allies would become enemies. Powerful men would scramble to cover their tracks. The system would not go quietly. But neither would she. By the time Clara stepped outside, the courthouse steps were alive with energy. Reporters pressed forward, cameras flashed, and murmured questions floated through the humid Charleston air. But Clara didn't stop to answer. Not yet. Beside her, Carter moved like a silent shield, his broad shoulders creating just enough space for her to breathe. Internal affairs agents hovered nearby, tense and watchful, but Clara didn't need protection from the crowd. She needed it from what she was about to uncover. The real battle was invisible, hidden in sealed records, closed-door deals, and silent threats whispered through back channels. Boone was only the beginning. Clara knew that. And the city, though not fully awake yet, was beginning to sense it too. At the bottom of the steps, a young reporter thrust a microphone toward her. "Judge Mays, do you believe today's events will lead to wider investigations into police misconduct?" Clara paused, lifting her chin. The wind caught the edge of her blazer, snapping it like a flag. "I don't believe it," she said. "I expect it." Another reporter, emboldened, shouted, "Are you afraid of retaliation?" Clara allowed a small, tired smile. Fear is what kept this system alive for so long. I'm done being afraid. The murmurs surged louder, but Clara moved through them with steady purpose. She wasn't just speaking for herself now. She was speaking for the countless voices that had been silenced before her, the victims who had no podium, no badge, no seat at the bench. Carter opened the door of the waiting car, but before Clara climbed in, she turned back one last time. Across the crowd, she caught the eyes of a young black girl standing with her mother near the edge of the square. The girl clutched a homemade sign in crayon, "Justice is watching." Clara's heart tightened. That small sign, in that small hand, mattered more than all the flashing cameras. She gave the girl a nod, a silent promise. Inside the car, the air conditioning blasted against the heat of the day, but Clara barely noticed. She leaned her head back against the seat, her mind racing. The mayor's office, the district attorney, the police union. Layers upon layers of protection built around corruption. And now, cracks were appearing. Agent Keene had already sent word. Boone was talking. Deals were being struck. Some of the names whispered in the halls of power were names Clara had once trusted. Mentors, colleagues, friends. It would be painful. It would be ugly. It would be necessary. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Carter glanced over from the driver's seat. "You sure you're ready for what's coming?" Clara opened her eyes, her voice steady. "I'm not ready," she said. "I'm determined." Outside the window, Charleston rolled past, the old, the broken, the beautiful, a city both wounded and waiting. Waiting for reckoning. Waiting for rebuilding. Waiting for someone not just willing to punish a few bad actors, but willing to tear down the rotten scaffolding they had built their empire upon. And for the first time in a long time, Clara Mays believed that maybe, just maybe, that someone was her.